Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Healthcare and Medical Ethics. Um, all right. So this week, we'll be interacting with an article written by Judith Jarvis Thompson, where she offers up a defense of at least of abortion under at least some circumstances. Um, Part of this article is actually really famous in the sense that ever since it was published in the 70s, people have continued to talk about the argument. That's the famous violinist argument. So in this video, we'll put most of our focus there. I have posted a systematic written response to all of the questions I asked in this week's reading questions. I did a really thorough job, gave some extra background information on some of those harder questions. For example, next time I teach this, I'll probably define what a slippery slope argument is for you in the questions. In live classes, we talk about this sort of thing. But I do explain what a slippery slope argument is in my written responses. Um, yeah, and I'll do that quickly here as well. But this video, instead of being systematic and going through everything, I'll just go through some of the arguments and really focus in on them. I think that's more effective from a learning perspective. I think students do a little better with talking about the more interesting arguments and maybe not covering every piece of information. And this discussion board this week will be on the famous violinist argument. So this video will be directly relevant to that. Okay, so let me just share my screen. I am going to pull up those reading questions and my written responses. Um, but again, I'm not going to just systematically read everything I wrote. Uh, if you want to do it that way, just go ahead and read what I wrote. I actually encourage you to do both. Listen to the video and read the responses. Okay. Um, so the title, Judith Jarvis Thompson, A Defense of Abortion, and as I noted, she doesn't defend abortion under all circumstances, just under a broad variety of them. Okay. So let's begin. This first question we will cover thoroughly. So Thompson begins by laying out what she takes to be an important premise in the pro-life case against abortion. Identify that premise, which she argues takes the form of a slippery slope argument. Slightly better phrasing would be to say identify the premise and the slippery slope argument that she thinks pro-life people give in defense of the premise. Okay. So let's look at A here. Thomas notes that the pro-life defender wants to argue that the fetus is not only human, but is also a person from conception. The basic idea is that all persons have rights, and therefore, whenever a fetus becomes a person, it has rights as well. This is just background. The key premise that the pro-life person uses that has a slippery slope structure is that we shouldn't arbitrarily pick a moment in the fetus's development when it crosses the line from being merely potentially a human person to a human person with rights. Hence, the only non-arbitrary option is to insist it is a human from conception. A slippery slope argument is one that says if you agree to some idea or other, then you will be forced to believe something else that is unreasonable to believe. So, in this context, the claim is that if one rejects the view that personhood is present from conception, then one must choose a different point arbitrarily. Okay, so let me stop sharing for a second. Um, in the rest of question one, Thompson says, look, um, sure, there is no perfectly non-arbitrary spot to say, here the fetus is at an insufficient level of development to have full human rights. Boom, it crossed the line. Now it has full human rights. So notice that in relation to last week's discussion on I believe it was chapter 2 on moral standing, or maybe it was chapter 3. We're using person to refer to any being with full moral standing. And the idea is, well, when does that occur? When does the fetus have full moral standing? Um, it's kind of hard to just pick a point in its development and say that's the point. So on the one hand, Thompson agrees with the pro-life person. Yeah, it is a little arbitrary. But then she uses an analogy with an acorn and a tree, and say an oak tree, and says, "Well, look, acorns are clearly not oak trees. Um, there is some point of development, maybe a vague range in there somewhere where it's more and more plausibly an oak tree." So her own view is, on the one hand, it is going to be a little arbitrary where you pick. On the other hand, it doesn't follow that we have to insist that the fetus is a person from conception, just like no one really wants to insist that an acorn is an oak tree as soon as it's germinated. Okay. Yet, for the sake of argument, and this is also part of question one, she's going to go ahead and grant the premise. She's going to say, okay, if you're pro-life and you want to insist life begins at conception, I'm going to give that to you and then just see what follows in regarding a fetus's right to life. Okay, so that's the gist of that first question. Okay, let's go on to, this is all summarized here. All right, actually, part D is important because it plays a role as we go on. Here's Thompson's reconstruction of the basic pro-life argument. P is for premise. Premise one, every person has a right to life, therefore a fetus has a right to life. Because remember, we're granting for the sake of argument that the fetus is a full-fledged human person from conception. The mother, premise two, also has a right to decide what to do with her own body. That's premise two. Premise three, but the fetus's right to life is stronger than the mother's right to do what she wants with her own body. Conclusion, abortion is wrong. Okay, so Thompson is reconstructing the uh, the main argument for the pro-life position in a form that's useful for discussion. So that the key claim really is premise three. Well, premise one's a key claim, and then this comparative claim in premise three is really the focus of her own arguments. Is it true that the fetus's right to life is stronger than the mother's right to do what she wants with her own body? Um, Let me pause a second. Now, why might someone think that? Well, let's say I'm going outside and I want to fire off for recreational purposes, let's say like a rifle. Okay. So I have the right to do what I want with my own body. I could swing the rifle to the left, to the right, point it, shoot it. But I can't shoot somebody else. So the basic idea is here is somebody else's right to life is so important that it kind of trumps my freedom to do what I want. Okay. So that's the intuitive reason. Cases like that are the intuitive reasons why someone might think P3 is true, that the right to life is the strongest right we have in some sense. Okay. Now, of course, Thompson's going to add some nuance and challenge this. Uh, I guess depending on the cases you choose, sometimes that seems kind of right. And if you choose some other cases, it becomes more questionable. Okay, now let's go to question two. In the last paragraph on page one and on to page two, Thompson states her famous violinist scenario. What happens? That's part A. What tough moral questions does this scenario raise? That's part B. And how would you answer the questions Thomas raises? Okay. The scenario is pretty simple. You wake up one day and find that a world famous violinist is attached to your body through a series of tubes or other medical devices. If you detach the violinist, she will die of kidney failure. But if you keep her attached to your body for 9 months, she will live. It is a key point that the violinist was kidnapped by others who attached her to your body. Hence, the violinist is innocent of forcibly attaching herself. Um, all right. So let me stop sharing so we can just chat. So really make this first personal. Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning. The Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped a violinist. It doesn't really matter that's a violinist per se. Um, it's actually always unclear to people why she chooses a famous violinist. The important part is it's another human being. They were kidnapped, so they didn't force themselves on you like a third party did. They attached that person to you and set it up in a medical way. So if you detach them, they're going to die of kidney failure or any other illness, really. Now, don't overthink it. Of course, they could do dialysis and all that. You just have to, let's just let it be stipulated that if they're detached from you in particular, they're going to die. Okay. We're just trying to create an analogy between the mother and the fetus and you and the violinist. Okay. All right. So the violinist is there against her will. You're there against your will. Um, you're kind of stuck there together. So the question is, and let's assume the risks of staying attached are basically the risks involved with carrying a pregnancy to term. There are dangers there. You're far more likely than not to survive and be fine, but there is some moderate risk. Okay, now, do you have a right to detach the violinist? Um, Thompson thinks the answer to this question is just obviously yes. Nobody has a right, even if they didn't force themselves upon you, to literally have access to your body, your organs, to stay alive for 9 months. So, at least in the case with the famous violinist, she thinks you're well within your rights to detach that person. She says, well, you might be morally noble to remain attached. You might be doing a very good thing, but you're not obligated. That's her point. You're not violating a duty to that person to detach them. So, this scenario raises questions about what another person's right to life entitles them to. Do you have to let someone else have access to your body as a resource if they are going to die without it and you will face moderate risks? Does your right to have control over your body entail that other people have no right to use your body to stay alive? And if we scroll back, um, this is basically why she reconstructs the basic pro-life argument in this manner. So look again at that third premise. The key claim is the fetus' right to life is stronger than the mother's right to do what she wants with her own body. And she's using the famous violinist scenario to challenge that assumption. So C says, do you agree or disagree with her? So not thinking ahead to the abortion case, just thinking of the violinist case, do you think it's okay to detach the violinist? All right. So let's move on to question 3. If you say yes, of course, the idea is that this is supposed to support the pro-choice position, and if you say no, this will ultimately support the pro-life position. In a little bit, though, we'll look at disanalogies between the two cases. Okay. So Warren has a section entitled The Pro-Life Argument and Rape Cases. She discusses pregnancy due to rape first because the analogy with the famous violinist is strongest here. So, of course, why is this a strong analogy? Well, in case of rape, the woman's forced to have sex, and if that leads to conception, that means the conception itself was forced. So there's a direct parallel in terms of a lack of autonomy in choosing um, to have sex, which could lead to pregnancy, or choosing to be attached to a violinist. Okay. And that's what I say here. Of course, what the two cases have in common is that the woman who was raped and the person attached to the violinist have been forced into their respective situations. But we could still probe and ask, well, how strong is this argument? Can you think of any disanalogies between the rape cases and the famous violinist case? And then B is more of a discussion question just for you to think about. Do your views on what you would owe to the violinist in regards to the use of your own body match up with your views on abortion in cases of rape? Why or why not? Okay, so here's a couple disanalogies between the famous violinist case and cases of rape. One disanalogy between the violinist case and the case of a woman who is raped and gets pregnant is that in the rape case, the person attached to you is your own child. Another disanalogy is that the rape case is likely to be even more traumatic than being forcibly hooked to a stranger. Hence, one needs to take these two disanalogies into account when evaluating the force of Thompson's argument that others have no right to your body as a resource to stay alive. Okay, so let me stop sharing. Now, that first disanalogy, um, you could argue would make her argument a little weaker. As a rule, we owe more to family members than we do to strangers. So even in the case of rape, and I don't want to talk about this dismissively or anything like that, because we're going to bring up the traumatic aspect in a second. Um, they are different though. One is you're attached to a child who's half genetically you, and in the other, you're attached to a complete stranger. Um, and in normal situations, we do owe more to family members than to non-family members. So, for example, if one of my kids were hungry, I'd be kind of a monster not to feed them. I have three sons. And if one of my neighbor's kids was hungry, well, I'd be kind of a jerk not to feed them, but I wouldn't be quite as bad because I owe more to my own kids. So if someone's pro-life, they might push back on this analogy here. But the other disanalogy, of course, is the traumatic nature of the event. And this might strengthen the case for pro-choice. Actually, I mean, it must certainly at least strengthen the case. We generally do not require people who are traumatically victimized in general to be responsible to take care of someone in the aftermath. Um, yeah, if it's too hard, it's too hard. We have a lot more empathy for what people can do once they've been harmed themselves. If it truly is, I mean, and I'll take women who've gone through its experience at face value. It often is incredibly traumatic to carry such a child to term, and that would strengthen the argument that abortion is permissible. Uh, so the analogy has its flaws, but it does get us thinking about the limits of another person's right to life. It's not obvious that their right to stay alive entails a right to the use of another person's bodily resources. Okay, let's go back to the questions. All right. Question 4. Read the section entitled The Mother's Right to Self-Defense. State the argument based on the killing versus letting die distinction that is given in support of not performing an abortion to save the mother's life. State the tiny house argument in favor of the mother's right to self-defense. Which are you more convinced of and why? All right, now this is a different sort of case. Uh, Thompson is now looking at, is abortion permissible when carrying the baby to term is just medically dangerous. So the pregnant woman, the mother, her life's in danger as she carries the baby to term. Believe it or not, there are some people, and Thompson labels them extreme pro-lifers who say under no circumstances can you get an abortion, even if you have to forfeit your own life. And she lays out the main argument they give for this. So what they do is they draw a distinction between killing someone and merely letting someone die. And they argue that killing someone's worse. So if you're the mother and you have an abortion, that's an act of deliberate killing. But if nobody intervenes, the child through the course of the pregnancy takes your life, well, from the doctor's perspective, they weren't actively killing you, they were letting you die. And that's bad. It's a bad result, but it's not as morally bad as actively taking a life. Therefore, it's better to let the fetus grow, take the life of the mother, than it is to have an abortion. Okay, now this um, assumes, of course, um, that the abortion isn't justifiable in self-defense, which is Thompson's counter argument. So she says, look, let's look at it a little differently. Let's say you're in a house, a really tiny, like a box maybe, and there's a baby growing in there with you rapidly. You could make it a little bit science fiction-y. And as the baby grows, it's crushing you, and eventually the baby will crush you and then walk out a free person. Thompson thinks it's pretty clear that killing the growing baby in that circumstance would be a simple act of self-defense, and that self-defense is in general, is morally justifiable. It would be in this case as well. So her point is that the killing, letting die distinction is trivial in comparison to the fact that one is protecting their own life as a form of self-defense by cutting someone else off access to their body, which they have a right to do, at least in cases of self-defense. So that's maybe a little tricky section to parse because there's a couple arguments going on there, but that is Thompson's point. The self-defense consideration is the weightier consideration uh, than avoiding killing someone, knowing you're going to let someone die anyway. Um, those, yeah, I mean, you're probably sitting there like, huh, like, why is that better again? And if you know the person's going to eventually going to die anyway, and you're not doing anything about it, and that's another sort of response you can give to that argument. In some cases, there's not much of a difference there at all. Okay. All right. So, to be clear, thus far, she has not given a generalized defense of abortion. She's mostly said, look, the right to life is not absolute. Here are a couple of cases in which abortion is morally justified. Case one, cases of rape. Case two, cases in which abortion is medically necessary to save a woman's life. Okay. Now, she does have one other argument that gets kind of messy, and it has to do with people seeds. Um, so let me just read my commentary here. So it says, read the section entitled The People Seeds Case, which is analogous to pregnancies that occur despite the use of contraceptives. Focus on the part that comes after the burglar. Describe the people seed scenario. What does Warren think this argument establishes? Um, Okay, and this might not be crystal clear. Okay, so let me just try and capture the point of the argument. The idea is you live in a house, you've put up a lot of locks on the doors, you put some like mesh over the windows, because you live in a neighborhood where these seeds float around, and if one lands in your house, a person actually starts to grow there, despite your best efforts to kick them out, with the screen doors and the mesh and the locks and all that, trying to keep those seeds out. So Thompson basically says, look, if you tried to keep the seeds out, and of course the seed is similar by design to like a sperm, um, that if you occasionally fail, have you really given the seed permission to inhabit your house or inhabit your body? So that's basically what she's saying. So let me read what I wrote here. The basic point Thomas wants to argue is your body is a bit like a house in the sense that you own it and you can control who enters and who does not. So if a woman uses birth control expressly to keep children from taking root in her uterus, then if one does happen to implant in non-rape and non-life-threatening conditions, that child has no right to stay implanted. Um, the analogy gets a little complicated, so we're not going to focus too much on this argument. But once again, it's worth noting that an important disanalogy here is that one is related to the child and not the person seed and the person that grows from that seed who happens to float in to the living room. But you kind of get how the two cases are analogous as well. If you're trying as hard as you can in some sense to keep from getting pregnant and then you do, it's kind of like letting someone enter, right? You've tried to bar them, they're there. What do you owe that person that has managed to get in? Okay. So that is what I wanted to focus on um, in this video. I cover the rest of the questions with a lot of thoroughness in my written responses, but it can be useful just to focus on some of the more, I guess, the part that's had the most influence, which is the famous violinist case, and just kind of let the rest go. And you should go read my responses to those, but your discussion board will be focused on the famous violinist case. All right, good job sticking around and reading this. And by the time you read this, the discussion board will be set up, and that'll be due Monday night. All right, have a good one.